This started as a talk about how to move your Google Workspace, but I want to do a separate talk really about cloud identities, why you have different, how your username, how your email address lets you log in a whole bunch of places, but you have different passwords everywhere, right? And it's because what companies do is they conflate, they merge together the notion of your account name and your email address, but they have their own identity provider for their own services. And so what you're really doing when you give, like if I have Google Mail and I've got my own domain at Google because I did one of the free workspaces years ago that they just took away. What I ended up with is I end up with a Google login, which is an identity service, right? That's what a login really is, and a password, an MFA, and all that other kind of stuff here at my account, foo.com. And it turns out that gives me access to Drive and the websites and the blogs, and it gives me access to Gmail. It doesn't make my mail be delivered here, but the identity services give me access to the mail that sits here. So if I'm Joe at foo.com and my mail shows up in the Google mailbox, then I use their Google login to get access to my mail. But it turns out that's because, and the mail's delivered there because they're in the domain, there are some mail records that say, hey, Google's going to be the mail provider for this domain, and all the mail shows up here, and then people use their Google identity services to actually log into that, right? And you're like, well, that isn't, what does that mean to me? Well, let's look at Facebook, for instance. We're going to go in the upper corner here. When I log into Facebook, I use the same email address, right? But the fact that it's the same email address, all it is a username, and it turns out all it uses that email address is for account recovery and for MFA. Are you really that person? Go click on this link in your mail, right? So when I log in and create an ID to Facebook, even though it's still joe at foo.com, it turns out these guys have their own identity provider with their own permissions for that account. It looks like it's kind of the same account because this was joe at foo.com over here, and it's joe at foo.com up here on Facebook. But that's really just because everybody pretty much has an email address or a phone number, and so your account name becomes your email address or phone number. But they have a completely different set of pools of identity, passwords, and security. And they have their own domain. It's facebook.com. Right? Oh, I should have put that in here. I'm going to make that facebook.com. You know what? Colon. Yeah, right? So they have their own domain, but your email still works because it's really your username. Now, if you're an Apple user, it's the same thing, right? I want to use Apple iCloud account to do my backup, but I still have my mail at foo.com, which is hosted in Gmail. So what is it really? Why do I have a different password at Apple? Right? If there was one identity all driven out of Google, I'd only have one password and one MFA. But because Apple manages all their own identities standalone, the same way Facebook does, they asked me for an email address, really for recovery. And because people don't forget their email addresses, and when they had account names, it was too hard to pick one. So when I sign into Apple with an Apple ID, right, my Apple ID, that ID is some Apple ID internally, and then it's bound to an email address for recovery. And so I can say joe at foo.com up here, but I have to log in with my Apple password, right? Because the red boxes are all isolated from each other. And that's why if you have a couple social media accounts and other things, you end up with multiple passwords. Even though the username looks the same, they're totally unrelated. It's totally just to support account recovery and MFA, and so they can do a little bare minimum amount of ID validation. The same thing goes with email. So email is a little different. There's two parts to email. There's the delivery part, and there's reading the email wherever it arrives. So there's routing email and reading email. If you have a foo.com in a Google workspace hosted by Google, then your Google ID works to read it, and your DNS entries, your domain, says to deliver the mail to Google, and Google will figure out what to do with it. You could move that mail, actually to cloud.com now, but you could move that mail delivery to outlook.com. And so the internet would just deliver your mail to a different mail provider. And then you're like, well, how would I read that? It turns out that Outlook has its own identities, Microsoft identities. Right? So if this was, here we could do a mail identity, and this would be Microsoft. Right? And so you'd have that. And so in that case, I would end up with another identity provider, but the mail delivery would all go there for foo.com. And then this box would be out, and all because of the routes for all the mail, all the MFA requests would be sent to Outlook.com, and I would log in with my Microsoft account, even though it was still joe@foo.com. So I'm joe@foo.com at all four of these providers, but they all have their own identity, and so I end up needing 4 different passwords. The only thing that links them together is my email address for recovery, and that's it. So that's kind of why you end up with multiple identities on the internet with multiple passwords, and why it's confusing when you think when your email and your Drive and everything else are at the same place. If you wanted to move your email away from Google with their custom domain, you could. You could move it somewhere else. You just change the delivery, and then you create an identity at that provider. The identities you've got, even though they have the same email addresses, have nothing to do with each other than they use the same address to do recovery. And also you remember it. And that's it. Have a great day. I hope that helps.